signal had been running for 11 days before anyone admitted it wasn't background noise. Commander Vera Okafor heard it first at ZO347 station time, when the observatory deck was empty and the only light came from the slow pulse of instrument readouts and the cold blue sprawl of the Kepler arm, visible through the forward glass. She'd been awake, 'cause sleep had started to feel like surrender. 14 months aboard the Meridian station since the last supply rotation. 14 months of the same 6 faces at breakfast, the same recycled arguments over dinner allocations, the same careful silence people used when they were trying very hard not to say what they were actually thinking. She had her coffee, real coffee, the last of it, hoarded like medicine, and she was sitting with her feet tucked under her on the observer's bench when the anomaly first resolved itself out of the static on Channel 7. She thought it was her own heartbeat at first. It had that rhythm, a long beat, 2 short ones, a pause. Then again. She put the coffee down. It took her 20 minutes to rule out instrument artifacts, and another 40 to isolate the source bearing. By the time she called Director Osai at 0512, she was shaking, and it had nothing to do with the cold. "It's directional," she told him, when he appeared in the doorway still pulling on his uniform jacket. Coming from the outer envelope, bearing 274, declination -11, Osai was 63 years old and had spent 31 of those years in deep space research. He had a face that had learned how to stay very still. He came and stood beside her and looked at the waveform on her display and did not say anything for a long time. "How structured?" he finally asked. "Very," she said. He looked at it for another 30 seconds. "Wake the others." By 0600 all 6 of them were on the deck. Vera watched their faces as they listened. Lynn, the xenobiologist, had both hands pressed flat on the console like she needed something solid to hold on to. Marchetti, the engineer, was already mentally pulling apart the transmission hardware, she could tell. His eyes had that distant inventory quality. Soo Jin from communications sat very still with her headset on, and her eyes closed and tears running freely down her face, which she seemed not to notice. Dr. Fedorov stood at the back with his arms crossed, and Vera had known him long enough to recognize the particular way his jaw was set, which meant he was frightened. Chen, the youngest of them, 26 and still prone to enthusiasm, had both hands raised to his mouth. The signal was not language, not yet, or not in any form they recognized, but it was organized. It repeated with tiny variations, like a theme exploring itself. It had what Vera could only call intention. "They're looking for something," Soo Jin said without opening her eyes. Nobody argued with her. "Distance?" Osai asked. Vera pulled up the triangulation. "Best estimate 6.3 light hours from our position. Moving toward us?" She hesitated. "Moving in a way that's consistent with having located us." Silence on the deck. Outside, the stars held their positions with total indifference. "All right," Osai said. "We follow protocol. We log, we observe. We do not respond without authorization from Earth." He looked at each of them in turn. "And we do not panic." Fedorov uncrossed his arms. "No," he agreed. "We absolutely do not panic." He said it in the specific tone of a man who was already panicking. The choir, that was what Soo Jin named them, and the names stuck with the kind of inevitability that good names always have, arrived at visual range on day 4. They were not what any of them had imagined. Every private human fantasy of first contact had involved something recognizable: bilateral symmetry, forward-facing eyes, something to which you could point and say, "There is the face, there is where the thinking happens." The choir were none of those things. They moved in formation through space without visible propulsion, a cluster of perhaps 30 structures that defied the word ship, the way a forest defies the word furniture. Organic and enormous and deeply, profoundly quiet-looking, despite the fact that they were producing a constant transmission so rich and dense that Soo Jin's equipment could barely hold it. "What are they doing?" Chen asked, from beside Vera at the imaging console. "I think," Soo Jin said slowly, still wearing her headset, still translating, "they're talking to each other." She paused. "About us, what are they saying?" Another pause, longer. "I can't tell yet. But the emotional register." She stopped herself. "Soo Jin," Vera said. "The emotional register," Soo Jin said carefully, "is not hostile. It's more like," she searched for the word, "clinical. The way a doctor sounds when they're working through a diagnosis." Contact came on day 9, and it came not as a signal but as a visitor. It appeared at the airlock without warning. No approach vector, no heat signature, no gravitational disturbance. One moment the airlock exterior camera showed the empty maintenance corridor. The next moment it did not. The motion sensors triggered, and Marchetti nearly had a cardiac event at his console. And Vera was already moving before she had consciously decided to move, because that was the kind of person she was. It waited in the outer lock for 47 minutes while they argued. "We let it in," Vera said. "We don't let it in," Fedorov said. At the same time, they looked at each other. "If it wanted to harm the station," Vera said, "it did not need to knock." "We don't know that it knocked," Fedorov said. "We know it stood at the door, which is the gesture of a being that understands the concept of permission," she said. Fedorov had no answer to that. They let it in. What came through the airlock was approximately the shape of a human being. Approximately. The proportions were slightly wrong in ways that Vera's brain kept trying to correct for and failing. The limbs a fraction too long, the head a fraction too smooth, the movement fluid in a way that biological joints don't produce. It stood in the inner lock and looked at them through whatever it used for eyes. Not eyes exactly, but a region of its face that seemed oriented toward them with attention. And it did not speak. "Hello," Vera said. It tilted its head, precisely 17 degrees. She clocked it without meaning to, the way you notice a thing that's just slightly off from what you expect. "We are humans," she said. "This is our station. My name is Vera." The visitor regarded her. Then it raised one of its two long hands and placed it flat against its own chest, over whatever region corresponded to the heart. "That's a gesture of," Chen started. "I know what it is," Vera said quietly. She raised her own hand and placed it flat against her sternum. The visitor was still for a moment. Then something shifted in the way it held itself. A tiny, almost imperceptible softening in the geometry of its posture, and it did the gesture again, except this time it moved its hand toward her. "Oh," Lynn said softly from behind Vera's shoulder. "Oh, it's saying you." They named him Bridge, eventually, because of how he arrived, and because of what he turned out to be. A connector, a mediator, the one the choir had sent across the gap. He didn't have a name in any sense they could parse. Or rather, he had a component in the choir's communication that functioned like identification, but it was less a word and more a chord, a specific harmonic they could not reproduce with human anatomy. So they called him Bridge, and he accepted this the way he seemed to accept most things about them, with a quality of attention that was not quite patience and not quite curiosity, but something in between that had no clean human word. The first 2 weeks were a negotiation of basics. Language turned out to be less of a barrier than they'd expected, not because Bridge learned theirs or they learned his, but because he arrived already in possession of a system, a constructed grammar of gesture, tone, and symbol that seemed built specifically as a meeting point. The choir had been watching human transmissions apparently for longer than anyone found comfortable to contemplate, long enough to build scaffolding. "How long?" O.C. asked on the third day, through the halting symbol language they were beginning to share. Bridge considered this. He produced a symbol that seemed to mean both duration and attention, watching over time. Then he produced a number. Chen did the math twice. Then he sat down. 212 years, he said. They had been watching since before the Industrial Revolution, watching from a distance that made observation safe and contact premature and study rich. The choir were patient in ways that biological beings struggle to fully conceptualize. Patience not as restraint, but as a fundamental quality of their consciousness, the way water doesn't resist waiting to find its level. Bridge explained this on the 9th day of his visit through a combination of symbols and a demonstration that left Vera sitting very quietly for a long time afterward. He showed her, through a holographic medium he produced from somewhere in his frame, a representation of time. Not a timeline exactly, but a space in which time had texture. Short-lived things were spiky and bright and brief. Long-lived things had the smooth, worn quality of riverbeds. The choir were old the way riverbeds are old. "And us?" she asked, pointing to the human symbols in his diagram. He touched the spiky, bright nodes. Then he looked at her with that quality of directed attention. "Short," she said. He did not confirm or deny it. He produced another symbol, one she was starting to recognize as his equivalent of but or however, or the nuance shifts here. Then he touched the bright nodes again. Interesting, she guessed. The posture softening, which was as close to a smile as he had. What the choir wanted was not what they had feared. Vera had braced herself for demands, for ultimatums, for the hierarchies of power that humanity had always assumed would characterize any contact with a species advanced enough to cross interstellar distances. She had read the history of first contacts between human civilizations, the ones that hadn't gone well, and she had carried the weight of that history into every exchange with Bridge. "Ready for it," braced. What the choir wanted was to play. That was not how Bridge said it. His symbol for the concept was more complex, involving meaning exchange and mutual growth, and something that translated loosely as the thing that makes understanding grow faster. But the activity he proposed, the structure of what they were offering, was recognizably a game. Rules, turns, moves that responded to other moves, a structure in which two minds could meet and discover what the other one was. Like chess, Chen said with a kind of awed disbelief. Not like chess, Sujin said. Chess has a winner. This is. She consulted the symbols Bridge had laid out. This is more like bridge. The card game. 4 hands, hidden information, communication through bids, strategy built from incomplete knowledge and careful inference. Everyone looked at Vera. She had learned bridge from her grandmother in Lagos, sitting at a table that wobbled on one leg, using a deck where the King of Hearts had a corner torn off so you always knew when he came around. She had played through 3 postings and 1 brief, failed marriage, and 14 months of deep space isolation. She played because her grandmother had played, and because her grandmother had said, with the absolute conviction of a woman who had survived a great many things, that bridge was the closest a human being could get to reading another mind without actually being inside it. She looked at Bridge. "Let's play," she said. The rules that Bridge laid out were not bridge and not chess and not any human game, but they borrowed from all of them the way languages borrow words, taking what was useful, adapting what wasn't. There were hands, there were bids, there were moves that constrained future moves, there was hidden information, and there was, critically, a partner structure. Humans and choir, across the table from each other, but also beside each other, signaling, communicating, building something together out of the space between what was known and what was inferred. Vera sat across from Bridge. Osi, who had played bridge in his youth and picked it up again as a courtesy, sat beside her. On Bridge's side, he was partnered with a second visitor, another of the choir, shorter and differently shaped, who arrived on the 14th day and who they named Threshold, because every time she entered a room the air seemed to change. They played for 6 hours the first time. Vera was not sure any of them moved during those 6 hours. She forgot to eat. She forgot the coffee she'd made at the start, which went cold, and then tepid, and then room temperature in its cup beside her elbow. She was operating at a level of concentration she hadn't reached since her doctoral defense. Except this was less like defending a thesis, and more like having a conversation in a language you'd only spoken in your head before, suddenly out loud, with someone who was listening. Bridge played with a precision that was not cold but was absolute. Every bid was considered. Every move responded to the specific shape of what had come before it. He did not bluff, or rather, he did what could only be called bidding into uncertainty, which was different from bluffing because it was transparent about the uncertainty, which made it either very honest or very strange depending on how you thought about it. Vera, on the other hand, played the way her grandmother had taught her, with her gut, with her instincts, with an almost musical sense of where the game wanted to go. She bid when she shouldn't. She held when the numbers said to move. She made a call in the 4th hand that Osi quietly said was mathematically inadvisable and which turned out to be correct, and she saw Bridge go very still for 3 full seconds after, which she was starting to understand meant he was recalculating something. When they finished, Bridge produced a symbol she hadn't seen before. "What is that?" she asked Sujin, who had been watching. Sujin was quiet for a moment, consulting. "It's something like..." She paused. "Something like unexpected." Vera looked at Bridge. "I surprised you," the posture softening. "Good," she said. Earth found out on day 17. Director Osi had been sending daily reports, properly logged and time-stamped and routed through proper channels, but the 11-hour signal delay meant Earth was always half a day behind, and the bureaucratic machinery of 3 separate space agencies meant that by the time anyone with actual authority read the dispatches, the situation had evolved considerably past what the dispatches described. The response came in at 0920, a Priority 1 communication from the Joint Deep Space Command, which was itself an institution that hadn't existed until 18 months ago and still had the slightly improvised quality of a thing assembled too fast. The message was long and used the word protocol many times and contained 3 direct orders: halt all contact activity, maintain the station in standby configuration, and await a response team currently en route aboard the JDSC vessel Resolution. Estimated arrival 14 days. Vera read the message twice. Then she set it down and went to find Bridge, who was in the xenobiology lab with Lynn, looking at slides through a microscope Lynn had set up for him, which he seemed to find fascinating in a way that Vera found unexpectedly moving. This ancient, patient being from a civilization 200 years ahead in observation, and God knew how much further in everything else. Peering through a simple optical device at cellular structures with the focused delight of a child at a science fair. "I need to explain something," she told him. He straightened and gave her his attention. "My government," she said slowly, using their shared symbol grammar, "has told me to stop." He produced the "but however" symbol. "But I don't think I will," she said. He was still for a long time. Then he produced a symbol she'd seen before, but in a different context. The one that meant something like authority or the source of permission. "You're asking who I answer to," she said. He repeated the symbol. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen table, and the wobbling leg, and the King of Hearts with the torn corner, and a woman who had lived through 3 coups and 2 famines, and still played bridge every Thursday because, she'd said, a game is a kind of promise. You show up, and you play your hand, and you trust the person across the table to be doing the same. "I answer to the game," Vera told Bridge. He was still for another 3 seconds. Then he placed his hand flat against his chest and moved it toward her. "You." And then he did something she hadn't seen before. He produced the authority symbol again, and placed it beside the game symbol, and combined them. It took her a moment. "The game is the authority," she said. "The rules themselves are the hierarchy." He held the posture softening. "Your whole civilization works that way," she said slowly. "You don't have leaders. You have the game." He produced the "but however" symbol, then the watching overtime symbol, then something new, a symbol she could only read as refinement through repetition, the getting better slowly by playing. "You've been playing for 200 years, she said, "learning us, and you came here now because." She looked at the symbol he placed next, and everything in her chest went quiet. It meant ready. She broke the news to the team that night at dinner. "They're not here to make contact," she said. "They've been making contact for 2 centuries. They're here because they've decided we're ready for the next stage." "What's the next stage?" Fedorov asked. "I don't know the full shape of it yet, but I think it starts with the game." "The game they invented specifically for us," Osi said. "Yes, a game built on incomplete information, signaling, trust, and strategy. A game where you can only win by understanding your partner. And by understanding your opponent," Lynn said. "And by understanding your opponent," Vera agreed. Fedorov was quiet for a moment. "They built us a game and then waited for us to be ready to play it." "That's kind," Chen said simply. Fedorov looked at him. "I was going to say alarming." "Both things," Sujin said. The resolution arrived in 13 days, 1 day early, which Vera thought was a message in itself. It was a military science hybrid vessel, the kind of ship that existed because humanity had been unable to agree on whether first contact was primarily a diplomatic event, a scientific opportunity, or a security situation, and had defaulted to making a vessel that was all 3 simultaneously, which meant it was excellent at none of them. Admiral Constance Park came through the dock with the efficiency of someone who had been in command long enough that efficiency had become a physical characteristic. She was 58 and had the particular stillness of military people who have learned to hold themselves in reserve, and she looked at Vera the way supervisors look at subordinates who have done something technically within protocol, but clearly in violation of intent. "You've been in active contact for 14 days, she said. 13, Vera said. The first day was mostly situational assessment. The order was to cease all contact activity. The order arrived after contact was already established. Ceasing it would have been a breach of trust that I wasn't willing to make." Park looked at her for a long moment. "Where are they now?" "Bridge and Threshold are in the observation lab. They've been here for 9 days. They're playing the game." "What game?" "I'll show you." Park watched the game for 2 hours without speaking. Vera played. Bridge played. Osi and Threshold completed the 4-hand structure. The symbols moved. The bids were made. The hands were played and the hands resolved, and the complex architecture of inference and trust that the choir had built into the rules proved itself once again, capable of carrying information that no language could. After 2 hours, Park said, "You know what this is." Vera looked up. "It's a diplomatic structure," Park said, "not a game. A framework for ongoing negotiation, with rules that prevent dominance and require mutual understanding to function." "Yes," Vera said. "They built a diplomatic framework that looks like a card game, so that we would engage with it without our threat responses activating. That's what I think." Park was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother taught you bridge," she said. Vera blinked. How do you? Your file is 47 pages long, Commander. I read it on the transit. Park looked at Bridge, who was watching both of them with that quality of directed attention. She taught you something you were going to need. Vera didn't have a response to that. Is it transferable? Park asked. The game. Can I learn it? I think it requires openness more than intelligence, Vera said carefully. Park's expression shifted slightly. I've commanded a fleet, she said. I know how to be open. With respect, Admiral, that's very different from what I mean. Park looked at her. Then she looked at Bridge. Then, slowly, she sat down at the table. The choir, it turned out, were not a single civilization. This took 3 weeks to understand properly, because the concept didn't map cleanly onto anything human. They were not a hive. They were not a collective. They were something more like a tradition, a shared practice that had been going on for so long that it had accreted a culture around it, and then a language, and then a way of moving through space, and then something that looked, from the outside, like a civilization but was really closer to a very old, very patient conversation. Bridge explained this on what Vera had started thinking of as a good day. A day when the symbol grammar clicked and moved between them with the ease of a game they both knew well. And what he communicated had the quality of something that had been carefully assembled for a human listener, like someone who had practiced a speech, not because they were lying, but because the speech was too important to leave to improvisation. The choir were a network of species, not a federation, not an empire, a network of those who had found the game and agreed to be changed by it. Some of them were old. A few were as young as humanity. None of them had come to the network through conquest or coercion. The mode of invitation was always this, observation, until the observed species showed the quality the choir called readiness, and then contact, and then the game. What does readiness look like? Vera asked. Bridge took a long time with this. He produced several symbols, discarded several, started again. Eventually what he showed her was a complex construction that she studied for almost a minute before she understood it. It wasn't a quality. It was a behavior. Readiness was what a species looked like when it had survived itself, when it had come close enough to destruction by its own nature to understand what was at stake, and had chosen, by a margin that might have been otherwise, to continue. We almost didn't make it, she said quietly. He held the posture softening. You watched us almost not make it again, and you didn't intervene. This time he produced a new symbol, something she read as the necessity of the choice being ours. Because it doesn't count if someone else saves you, she said. He looked at her for a long time. Then he produced the ready symbol again. And then, for the first time, he produced a symbol she hadn't seen before, one that she would translate later, with Sujin's help, as welcome, or perhaps more precisely as now we can begin. Admiral Park's breakthrough came on day 31. Vera had not expected it. Park was a formidable intelligence and a natural strategist, but the game demanded something that strategy often works against. It demanded willingness to be uncertain, to bid without certainty, and trust your partner to fill what you couldn't see. And Vera had thought that Park's command habits would work against her. She was wrong. Park, it turned out, had spent 20 years of naval and command learning to work with incomplete information. She had made decisions without full intelligence for so long that she had developed a sense for the shape of what she didn't know, a kind of tactical humility that turned out to be exactly what the game needed. When she bid the truth of her uncertainty, which was not bluffing and not guessing but something precise, the honest representation of the edge of her knowledge. And that, Bridge showed through the structure of his responses, was what the choir valued. Not confidence, not knowledge, the honest edge of both. On day 31, Park made a bid that could not have been made from knowledge. It required inferences stacked 3 deep, a reading of Bridge's previous moves that assumed memory and pattern recognition and a theory of his state of mind. And Bridge went still for 6 seconds, which was the longest Vera had ever seen him hold. When he moved again, he produced a symbol none of them had seen before. Sujin worked on it for an hour. When she had a translation, she came to find Vera with an expression that was hard to read. What does it mean? Vera asked. It means something like, Sujin paused, something like seen or recognized, or she stopped again, Sujin. The closest English I can get is, you played like one of us. Day 38, the choir extended the invitation, not to the station, not to a specific person, to humanity. Through Bridge, in a formal symbol sequence that Sujin recorded and spent 2 days carefully translating, the choir articulated what the network offered. and what it required, and what it meant to be part of something that was 200,000 years old, and still, by the standards of the universe, relatively young. The offer was knowledge, not technology. The choir were careful about this, and the carefulness itself was eloquent. Raw technology transferred without context was how civilizations poison themselves. What they offered was context, participation in the ongoing conversation, the slow, patient, centuries-long process of mutual understanding that the game made possible. The requirement was simply to play, to keep playing, to bring to the game the specific, irreplaceable quality of human consciousness, the spiky, bright, unpredictable, short-burning intensity of minds that knew they were brief and made things anyway. What it meant, this was the part Su-Jin read aloud to all of them together, on the observation deck with the stars as backdrop, in a voice that was not quite steady. What it meant was that the choir had found, in their 200 years of watching, something in humanity they did not have and could not manufacture. Something they needed. They had named it, in their symbol grammar, with a complex construction that Su-Jin rendered as approximately, the quality of playing as if the hand matters. Because for us, Vera said, the hand always matters. We don't get another one. That's what they've been watching, Lin said. That's what they came for, Osi said. Not to save us, Chen said, very quietly. Not to conquer us. They came because they need what we are. Vera sat with Bridge that evening, after the others had gone. They didn't play. They sat in the observation lab with the stars visible and the choir's formation a distant shimmer at the edge of the sensor range. And Vera thought about her grandmother's kitchen, the table with the wobbling leg, the deck with the marked King of Hearts, the Thursday evenings that had felt, to a small child, like a waste of time. 4 people sitting around a table doing something that produced nothing, built nothing, went nowhere except round and back round again. She had asked her grandmother once why she kept playing, into her 80s, when her eyes were failing and she had to hold the cards very close to her face to see them. Her grandmother had been quiet for a long moment, which was unusual for her. She was a woman of continuous commentary, and then she'd said, because I was given a partner, and I owe it to them to learn everything I can about what they're holding. Vera looked at Bridge. That's what this is, she said. That's all this is. You were given a partner, and you want to know everything you can about what they're holding. He placed his hand against his chest and moved it toward her. You. And now you've dealt us in, she said. He produced the now we can begin symbol. She sat back. The stars held their positions. Somewhere in the complex silence of the universe, 200,000 years of patient, careful watching tilted imperceptibly on its axis, and a new hand was dealt. All right, she said, let's play. The next 6 months were the strangest and most intense of Vera's life, which she acknowledged was saying something, given that she had spent the previous 14 months believing that first contact was the strangest and most intense experience her life would contain. More of the choir came, not all at once, gradually, in the careful incremental way of a process that understood the importance of acclimation. 2 more of the formations. 6 more individuals in the intermediary role that Bridge held. A dozen different games running simultaneously across 3 stations as Earth, responding to the Meridian reports with a combination of terror and grudging fascination, began to send more people. Scientists, diplomats, linguists, strategists, a retired chess grandmaster from Moscow named Volkov, who turned out to be deeply bad at the choir's game and magnificently, articulately aware of exactly why, which made him useful in ways nobody had anticipated. Vera played every day. She played until the symbol grammar stopped feeling like translation and started feeling like a second language, fluent enough to dream in. She played until Bridge's tells were as familiar to her as the tells of someone she'd known for years. The 6-second stillness when something surprised him, the barely perceptible postural shifts that signaled he was recalculating, the way he held his hands just slightly differently when he was bidding at the edge of his information and trusting her to fill the gap. She played until, on a Thursday morning 4 months after first contact, she noticed the Thursday, her grandmother's day. She made a bid that she did not consciously understand, that came from somewhere below deliberate thought. That was correct, and Bridge held still for 9 seconds, and then produced the symbol she had first seen when Park had her breakthrough. Seen, recognized, you played like one of us. Except this time he added something. A symbol she hadn't cataloged before. She flagged it for Su-Jin. Su-Jin came back to her that afternoon. It's a modifier, she said, on the scene symbol. What does it modify it to? Sujin held up her screen where she'd written out the translation. It read, "Not like one of us. Better." Vera looked at the screen for a long time. "He's saying I played like a human," she said. "Yes," Sujin said, "and that's the better." "That's the better," Sujin agreed. Park sent a message to JDSE on month 5 with a recommendation that was unprecedented in the history of the Joint Command and would remain controversial for years afterward. That the game be made mandatory instruction at all levels of the diplomatic corps, the military officer track, and, she added this last quietly, without fanfare, every secondary school on Earth. The reasoning she gave was strategic. The reasoning she felt, Vera suspected, was something she couldn't have said in an official document. That the game was teaching them something they hadn't known they needed to learn. Not just about the choir, about themselves. Because you could not play well without doing something extremely difficult. You had to hold your own hand and simultaneously model your partner's hand and simultaneously model your opponent's hands. And you had to do this in real time with incomplete information. And you had to trust, and you had to be willing to be wrong. And you had to, this was the thing, the central, unreasonable human demand the game made. You had to care about how the game went for everyone at the table, not just yourself. You had to want the game to be good, not just to win. It was, Vera thought, the most human demand she had ever encountered. And the choir, in 200 years of watching, had understood that it was what humanity was capable of at its best, and had built them a table to sit at. The moment that would be recorded in every subsequent account of the first contact was not the day the choir arrived, and it was not the day Park made her breakthrough, and it was not the day the invitation was extended. It was a Tuesday in month 6, morning, on the observation deck with coffee. Good coffee now, priority supply shipment, and Bridge had arrived early, which he had begun to do, and Vera was already there, which she had begun to do, and they sat in what had become their established configuration. Across from each other, cards not yet dealt, in the specific quality of not yet beginning that both of them had started to appreciate as its own kind of communication. Bridge looked at her. He produced a symbol she knew well, duration, attention, watching over time. Then he pointed at her. "Me?" she said. He produced another symbol, the one that meant the thing that makes understanding grow faster. "The game?" He shook his head slightly, a human gesture he had adopted, which still surprised her every time. Then he combined the symbols, watching over time and the game thing and her. She thought about it. "You've been watching me play," she said, "not the game me." He held. "Since the beginning?" The posture softening. "You were studying me specifically." He produced a new symbol, one she catalogued and brought to Sujin later, who translated it after an hour as something approximately meaning, "I was given you as my assignment." "The choir assigned you to me," she said. He produced the affirmative. "Why me?" He looked at her for a long time. Then he went through a careful sequence of symbols she watched with full attention. Knowing this was important, knowing he had probably prepared this sequence the way her grandmother had prepared her bridge hands. Long thought, then execution. What he said was approximately this. The choir had found, across 200 years of observation, certain humans who embodied the quality they needed in concentrated form. Not leaders, not geniuses, not the powerful or the famous. Humans who had learned, through whatever particular combination of love and loss and practice, to hold uncertainty without flinching, to play their hand honestly, to care about the game. Her grandmother had played bridge in Lagos on Thursdays for 40 years. Her signal had not been the radio transmissions. It had been a behavior pattern that the choir had catalogued across generations, recognizing it for what it was. The practice of the thing they needed passed down, handed on. "She was in your data," Vera said. Bridge produced the yes. "You sent me out here because you'd been watching her," Vera said, "and watching me, and waiting." He produced the ready symbol, and then he produced the now we can begin symbol. And then he reached across the table and he dealt. The first session of what would become known as the Meridian Table occurred on month 7, day 3. Representatives of 42 human nations and 6 choir formations sat, or their equivalents of sat, around a structure that was not exactly a table and not exactly a room, built jointly by Marchetti and Bridge over 6 weeks using materials from both sides, which had led to several fascinating engineering arguments that neither party had expected and both had enjoyed. The game they played was no longer quite the game Bridge had first proposed, because games evolve when enough people play them seriously. It had absorbed elements of human card games and choir communication forms, and 2 or 3 things that seemed to have emerged spontaneously from the hybrid culture of the station, which was itself a thing nobody had planned for, and which was therefore wonderful. Vera sat across from Bridge, as always. She dealt, as always, because Bridge had established on day one that she was to deal when they were paired, and she had asked him why, and he had produced a symbol that turned out, when Sujin translated it, to mean something like, "The one who learned first holds the ritual." It was, he had indicated, a choir custom. The teacher deals. She had laughed when she understood it. "I'm not your teacher," she'd said. "Your civilization is 200,000 years old." And he had produced, very carefully, the "not like one of us" symbol, and then the better symbol, and then the "I was given you as my assignment" symbol, and she had understood. She dealt 13 cards to herself, and held them fanned in one hand and looked at them with the specific evaluative attention of someone who had been doing this since childhood, reading the shape of a hand the way you read a face. What is here? What is missing? What does this tell me about what my partner might be holding? Across from her, Bridge had his own hand, held in his 2 long fingers, and she had no idea what was in it. That was the game, that was, she thought, always the game. You sit down across from something you don't fully understand. You look at what you have. You make your best honest bid. You trust the person beside you. You play. She looked at Bridge. 2 clubs, she said. He tilted his head 17 degrees and responded. In the end, what the historians would argue about, and they would argue about it for generations, because it was the kind of thing historians are built to argue about, was whether humanity had been chosen or had chosen, whether the choir had found them ready, or whether the readiness had been manufactured by 200 years of patient tending, invisible hands moving in the dark. Vera's position, which she gave in various forms to various audiences over the following decades, was that the question contained a false binary. You don't choose the hand you're dealt, she said, but you choose how to play it. The choir chose to wait for us to choose. She paused. That's not manipulation, that's faith. The follow-up question invariably was, faith in what? And her answer was always the same. Faith that we were worth the wait. She played with Bridge for 11 years. In that time, she watched humanity's relationship with the choir evolve with the specific lurching non-linearity of all relationships conducted between very different beings. Moments of extraordinary comprehension, followed by complete mutual bafflement, followed by the kind of recovered understanding that is richer for having been lost. She watched Park's recommendation about the game become reality, slowly, as it always does, through bureaucracy and argument and compromise, until there were school curricula and officer training programs, and a small but devoted worldwide culture of people who played the choir's game not for diplomacy, but for the same reason anyone plays any game. Because it was true. She watched Sujin publish the definitive account of choir communication linguistics, and then immediately begin the revision that would occupy the next 15 years. She watched Chen, who had been 26 when this began, grow into the role of lead cultural liaison and develop an understanding of the choir's game that exceeded hers in technical precision, though she thought, and Bridge's responses suggested he agreed, that precision was not the same as fluency. She watched Fedorov, who had spent the first weeks of contact convinced he was frightened, slowly realized that what he was feeling was something else, something without a good word, something between reverence and the specific relief of a person who has been braced for the worst for a very long time, and finds the world is still here. She watched Bridge. He did not change in any way she could measure. His posture softening remained precisely the same. His tells were consistent. His quality of attention, that specific, patient, total directedness of a being for whom time had a different texture, was undiminished. But there was something that accumulated over 11 years of play. Something she couldn't name because there wasn't a word for it in English, and the choir's symbol for it was the one that meant "I was given you as my assignment" combined with the ready symbol combined with the duration symbol. She called it, in her private notation, known. She was known to him. He was known to her. That was the end product of 11 years of bidding honestly into uncertainty with someone whose hand you could never fully see. On the last day she played with Bridge before her rotation home, there were others now, younger, better rested, trained in the game from the beginning rather than having had to construct the practice from grandmother memory and instinct. She dealt the final hand and looked at her cards and felt the full weight of what was here. 13 cards, and a partner across the table, and 42 nations somewhere below them, and 200 years of watching, and the whole enormous quiet universe doing what it does. She made her bid. Bridge made his. They played the hand. It was a good hand, one of the best she could remember. The cards fell right. The inferences proved out. The moment came when she knew before the last card hit the table that they had made it, that the hand was theirs, and she felt something that her grandmother had described to her once as the small but real joy of having done the thing you came to do. When it was over, Bridge placed his hand on the table, palm down. She put her hand over his. He was cool to the touch, structured differently than human tissue, not soft in any biological way. She had known the feel of his hand for 11 years and still found it remarkable. The place where two very different things met and agreed to be adjacent. He produced one symbol. She knew it. He had used it the first time on day 9, and she had thought it meant something simple, and she had been revising that translation ever since. Not welcome, not now we can begin, not any of the things she'd thought it was. Sujin's final translation, arrived at in the last year after a great deal of careful comparison, was a phrase rather than a single word. It meant, we played this hand honestly, and now we know each other better than we did before, which is the point of the game, which is the point of everything. Yes, Vera said, we did. She collected the cards. She shuffled them, a long, thorough bridge shuffle, the kind her grandmother had done, hands moving through the motions that were muscle memory now, pure, older than thought. The cards snapped and whispered and settled. She held them out across the table. Bridge cut the deck. She dealt. The second year brought complications nobody had planned for, which was itself a kind of testament to how well things were going. You only get the complicated problems after you've solved the simple ones. The simple problem had been, are they hostile? The answer was no, and it was a no so thorough and structural that it had gradually stopped being a question anyone asked out loud, though it remained a question that certain institutions asked quietly in certain rooms, and would probably continue to for some time. Vera understood this. Fear was not irrational. Fear of something enormous and unknown was, in fact, exactly rational. What mattered was whether fear was the last word or just the first one. The complicated problems were things like, what does it mean for Earth's political structures when there is suddenly an entity in the solar system, multiple entities, that all of humanity's competing governments must address as a shared point of contact? What does it mean for human philosophy when the universe turns out to contain something that has been watching for 200 years and finds the watching unremarkable? What does it mean for religion, for the various human traditions that had mapped the cosmos and found it empty of meaningful intelligence, to discover that the map was wrong? And what does it mean for every human child who has ever looked at the stars and wondered if they were alone? Vera was not a philosopher or a politician or a theologian. She was a researcher and a commander and increasingly a games player. But these questions arrived at her table because she was the point of first contact, and the world had a way of directing its questions toward the point of origin, even when the origin had nothing to add. She answered when she could. She deflected when she couldn't. She played the game every day and let the game do what it had always been good at, clarifying what mattered. The chorus was what they started calling the broader choir presence, not bridge and threshold specifically, but the accumulated weight of 40-plus vessels and however many individual beings, a number that was itself a translation problem because the choir's concept of individual did not map cleanly onto the human one. Were they individuals? They had distinct personalities, distinct histories, distinct tendencies in the game, but they were also continuous with each other in ways that made individual seem like the wrong unit of measurement. The way a single conversation is part of a speaker but also more than the speaker alone. The chorus attended, in various distributed forms, to human civilization at something like real-time scale once the gate. A word bridge provided, in one of those symbol sequences that turned out to be so exact that the translation was immediate. Once the gate between the station and the choir, S-vessel network was established. The gate was not a door, physically. It was a communications medium. A way of sending symbol sequences at speeds that collapsed the 11-hour delay to something negligible. It was, in human terms, the equivalent of the internet, except that its other end was a 200,000-year-old civilization that had chosen, for reasons of genuine warmth, to plug into humanity's particular conversation. What the chorus sent, in those first months of real-time connection, was mostly questions. Not the questions humanity had expected, not inquiries about weapons or resources or strategic positions or the thousand anxieties that human fiction about first contact had always projected onto the alien mind. The choir asked about music, about the specific mathematics of human storytelling, the way human narratives always curved toward resolution, and what that meant about the human relationship with time. About cooking, not the nutritional structures, but the practice, the ritual, the fact that humans put enormous creative energy into transforming materials into experiences that lasted seconds and then were gone. About grief, which fascinated them in ways that Bridge had difficulty making precise. The closest he got was a symbol that translated as the shape that love leaves when its object is removed, which was itself a thing Vera had to sit with for a long time. They asked about Bridge, the card game, specifically about the history of it, the culture around it, the way it had moved through human populations and taken on different meanings in different places. Vera told them what she knew and sent them to Sujin for the linguistics and to Chen for the cultural anthropology. And at some point the chorus produced, through Bridge, a symbol sequence that Sujin translated as something like, "We recognize this practice as older than its rules." "What does that mean?" Chen asked. "I think," Sujin said carefully, "they're saying that humans were playing bridge before they invented bridge. That the behavior pattern, the hidden information, the signaling, the trust across the partnership is older than the game. The game just gave it rules." Vera thought about her grandmother, who had played before she had formal rules for it, who had played in spaces where the rules changed depending on who was at the table, who had said that the point was never the rules. "Yes," she said, "that sounds right." Month 19, Volkov solved the game. Not solved in the sense of found a winning strategy. The choir had built the game specifically to resist that kind of solution, to be rich enough that no algorithm would exhaust it. Solved in the sense of understood it completely, which turned out to be a different and more interesting problem. He came to Vera at Zo 700 on a Wednesday, with a notebook full of notation that was half Russian mathematics and half a symbol grammar he'd developed independently of Su Jin's official translation system, which Su Jin had reviewed and found simultaneously incorrect in its mappings and more accurate in its conclusions, which she described as deeply irritating and also the most interesting linguistic problem of her career. "The game has a purpose outside the game," Volkov said. This was not a question. He had the tone of a man who had worked through something very carefully and arrived somewhere he hadn't expected. "Yes," Vera said, "it is a training system for a specific cognitive mode." He consulted his notebook. "The mode in which you hold the full complexity of a situation, your own position, your partner's position, your opponent's position, the unknown variables, without collapsing that complexity into a false simplicity, without pretending you know what you don't know, and without being paralyzed by what you don't know." "Yes," Vera said again. "They have been playing this game, or versions of it, for..." He paused. "Bridge told you 200,000 years? Approximately. And they believe that sufficient play develops this cognitive mode not just as skill but as a habit, as a default." "That's my understanding." Volkov was quiet for a moment. "They are patient," he finally said, "extraordinarily. They came here expecting to play with us for centuries before the game would take," he said. "Before it would become part of how we think." Vera looked at him. "They didn't come for contact," he said. "They came to start a curriculum." She had thought about this. She had thought about it in exactly those terms, and also in other terms, and had never found a framing that felt dishonest or a framing that felt wholly comfortable. "They came because they need what we are," she said, "and what we can become with practice." "What do they need from us?" "Bridge showed me a diagram," Vera said, "a representation of the choir's civilization across time. Very long, very smooth, very consistent. And then human civilization in the same diagram, short, spiky, unpredictable." She paused. "They have persistence, we have, I don't know the word." "Combustion," Volkov said. She looked at him. He had the slightly abashed expression of a man who had surprised himself. "The analogy is not precise," he said. "No, it's good," she said. "They have endurance, we have combustion, and they think the combination is." "Interesting," he said. "The word Bridge uses is closer to necessary," she said. Volkov looked out the observation window for a moment. Then he looked at his notebook. Then he looked at Vera with the expression of a man who had spent 50 years studying games and had just, late in the afternoon of his career, understood what games were for. "We should teach everyone to play," he said. "Park already made that recommendation. Park recommended it for strategic reasons. I am recommending it because it is correct." He paused. "There is a difference. Year 2, month 7, the grief conversation." Bridge had been working up to it for weeks. Vera could tell. There was a quality to his attention in the days before that was subtly different from his usual focus, a kind of careful prearrangement, like someone who is preparing to say something difficult and is rehearsing the approach. He brought it up after a game. They had played particularly well that day, the kind of session that felt effortless only in retrospect, where the bids had found each other and the hands had fallen cleanly, and the communication between them had operated at a level below conscious. Symbol production, pure inference meeting pure inference. He produced the grief symbol, the one that translated as the shape that love leaves when its object is removed. You want to understand grief, she said. He held. What specifically do you want to understand? He produced a sequence. Sujin was not there. It was evening, station time, and they were alone, so Vera worked through it herself, slowly. Using 11 months of fluency, the choir did not grieve, not in the human sense. Their individual members transitioned, eventually, after very long lives, but the transition was so gradual and so integrated into the choir's continuous being that the human pattern, the sudden whole, the shape where something was, did not occur. They had watched human beings grieve for 200 years, and they found it the most difficult human behavior to model. Not the most painful. They understood pain. They had watched enough human pain to map its structures. But grief was different from a pain. Pain was the presence of something bad. Grief was the absence of something good. And absence, Bridge was trying to communicate, was a concept the choir did not have the same way humanity did. Because you don't lose things, Vera said slowly, you persist. Everything you love for a long time, and then it changes very slowly, and you change with it. He produced a symbol she read as approximately correct, but incomplete. What's missing? He worked through a long sequence. She parsed it piece by piece. He was saying, we don't lose the things we love, but we have always known that humanity does. And we have watched, for 200 years, what you do with the loss, what you build from it, the music and the stories, and the specific quality of human attention that seems to intensify in the face of impermanence. We pay attention because we know we won't always be able to, Vera said. He held. The spiky brightness, she said. That's what this is. He produced the now we can begin symbol. You've been trying to understand this since the beginning, she said. Since before you arrived. You've been watching us lose things and watching what we do with the loss for 200 years, and you still. She stopped. She thought about her grandmother, who had died when Vera was 31, sudden and absolute, and the way the kitchen table had looked afterward. The chairs pulled back to their positions, and the card deck on the shelf, and the wobbling leg, still wobbling, still the same, and the everything else entirely different. You can't fully understand it, she said, because you can't have it. Grief requires loss, and you don't lose the way we lose. Bridge was very still. You're not going to be able to understand this one from watching, she said. You'll have to take our word for it. He produced a symbol. She took a moment with it. It was not a word she'd seen used this way before. The symbol usually indicated a mathematical operation, a function applied to a variable, but the context made its meaning clear. He was saying, we trust you. That's new, she said. He held. You've been watching us for 200 years and you just told me you trust us. The posture softening. Because we're playing the game, she said. He produced the now we can begin symbol. No, she looked again. He produced a modification of it she hadn't seen before. Now we have been beginning. The present perfect. The thing that started and is still in the act of starting, still becoming. Now we have been beginning, she said softly. Yes, I think that's right. Year 3 brought the first crisis. It came not from the choir, who had given no indication that they were capable of or interested in acting in bad faith, but from humanity itself, which retained a robust capacity for both. A faction within the JDC Vera never learned exactly who. Names were managed carefully above her clearance level, had spent 18 months conducting a parallel research program. Not contact, not the game, something else. An analysis of the choir's formation patterns, their drive signatures, the structural vulnerabilities that might exist in vessels that moved the way the choirs moved. Weaponizable knowledge, a hedge. It was, in purely strategic terms, not irrational. The history of human contact with other humans suggested that any relationship of asymmetric power required a deterrent. The choir were 200,000 years advanced. The deterrent calculus, if you ran it cold, pointed toward. Learn everything you can about how they might be vulnerable, before the relationship matures to the point where you've lost the option. Bridge found out. Not through espionage. There was no evidence the choir had penetrated any secure system. He found out through the game. Vera was never entirely clear on the mechanism. What she understood afterward was that the game was not purely recreational. It never had been. And that a sufficiently experienced player could read in the quality of a partner's bids the shape of things the partner was not saying. The way a skilled bridge player can sometimes infer, from a hesitation or an unusual choice, that their partner knows something they haven't declared. Bridge had been watching her play for 3 years. He knew the quality of her bids when she was carrying something. She had not been carrying it consciously. She had not known about the program. But she had known that something was wrong in the institution around her, and that knowledge had found its way into her hands without her intending it. He waited until after the game to raise it. That was also characteristic. He was never confrontational. He never pushed. He produced the trust symbol. She looked at it. Yes, she said. He produced it again, except this time it was in the past tense, the trust that was and is now in question. Her stomach went cold. What happened? He produced the now we can begin symbol. Then he negated it, a symbol she had seen used for negation before, the denial of a thing that should be. Now we cannot begin, she said. Someone in my government has been working against the relationship. He held. She did not try to minimize it or explain it. She sat with it for a moment and let it be what it was. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" He produced the trust symbol again, this time in the present tense, active, ongoing. "You still trust me," she said, the posture softening, "even though this happened." He produced a new symbol. She worked through it carefully. It meant something like, "Your civilization is made of many hands, and the game is not over because one hand was played badly. The game continues," she said. He produced the yes. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I need to fix this." He produced the but however symbol. Then the trust symbol. Then the now we have been beginning symbol. He was saying you don't fix it by fixing it. You fix it by continuing to play honestly. The game is the fix. She carried this conversation in her chest for the rest of that year, taking it out and examining it at odd moments. The choir had spent 200 years building a framework for exactly this, for the moments when one party at the table played in bad faith. Not a punitive framework, not a deterrence framework, a continuance framework. Keep playing. The game continues as long as the game continues, and the game's continuation was itself the answer to its own interruption. She pulled every string she had access to, which after 3 years of first contact were more than she'd had before. The parallel research program was reviewed and restructured. It did not disappear entirely. She was not naive enough to expect that, but its object changed, from vulnerabilities to the partnership itself, from how do we hurt them if we must, to how do we understand what this is. It was, she thought, a beginning, not the beginning, one of the many still beginning beginnings. Year 4, Lynn's discovery. She had been working on choir biology since Bridge first arrived, working around the edges, because direct research required consent, and the consent protocol was its own long, careful conversation. And what she had built was a picture, assembled from inference and observation, and the things Bridge was willing to show. What she found was that the choir's biological structure, to the extent that biological was the right word for something that had evolved in an environment with very different physical parameters, included a mechanism Lynn could only describe as a resonance system, not a language faculty and not a neural network in any recognizable sense, but something that functioned as both, a system for encoding information in the body at a physical level, the way music encodes itself in the vibration of the air, the way a bell holds its note after it's been struck. They don't just communicate, Lynn said. They carry information about previous communication in their structure. Every exchange leaves a trace. Every game played. She paused. Every game played changes them, Vera said. Permanently, Lynn said. Not dramatically, incrementally. But the resonance accumulates. Vera looked at Bridge, who was present at this conversation because he had indicated, through the symbol grammar, that he would be comfortable with it. "You changed by playing with us," she said to him. He produced the yes symbol. Is that something you chose? Something that happens, or something you decided?" He worked through a careful sequence. Lynn had enough symbol grammar now to follow it independently, and they translated together, checking against each other. He was saying, the change is the purpose. The game is not a means to an end. The game is the mechanism by which beings become more than what they were before they played. "The game changes you," Vera said slowly, "and it changes us." He produced the now we have been beginning symbol. "How different are you?" she asked, "from what you were before you came here?" He was still for 6 seconds. Then he produced a symbol she had never seen before and could not parse on her own. She waited. Lynn waited. Bridge held it in the air between them for a long moment. Then, very deliberately, he raised both hands, an unusual gesture. He normally kept the symbol production to one hand and placed them on either side of the symbol like brackets. "He's framing it," Lynn said quietly, "making sure we see it clearly." Vera looked at the symbol. She turned her full attention on it. It was composed of two elements she knew. The "I was given you as my assignment" symbol and the duration symbol, together. "The thing that has been given and has been lasting. You were assigned to us," she said, "and you have been changed by being assigned, by the duration of it," he held. "You are different from what you were before you were sent here. Because of us, because of the game." He produced the trust symbol, then the yes symbol, then the now we have been beginning symbol. "You came here to change us," Vera said, "and we changed you." He produced the posture softening, but this time, and she had never seen this, he held it. Not the brief shift and return of his usual expression, but sustained, present, held. "That was also the point," she said. The posture softening held. Lynn put her hand over her mouth. Vera let herself feel what she was feeling, which was the specific quality of being understood by something vast and patient that had chosen to spend years at a table with you for the explicit purpose of being changed by the encounter. "We matter to you," she said. "Not strategically, not scientifically." Bridge raised one hand. He placed it flat on his chest. He moved it toward her. "You." Then he added something, the duration symbol. For a long time, Year 6 brought the first formal integration event, which was the choir's term for what humans kept wanting to call a summit, which the choir kept gently correcting by noting that a summit was a top, and what they were proposing was a middle, a meeting point in the center of a thing still growing. 200 human representatives and 12 choir representatives gathered on a platform that Bridge and Marchetti had spent 8 months building. Not aboard either civilization's vessel, not on Earth, but in a neutral space between, a structure with the architectural quality of a place that was trying to belong to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone. The integration events ran for 7 days. They were structured around the game, not played continuously. The game served as architecture. The days were organized around sessions, each session beginning and ending with a hand, the hand serving as the grammar that held the rest of the communication together. Vera played in most of them. She played with Bridge and with Threshold and with 2 new choir representatives she had not met before, whose names in symbol grammar were complex enough that she gave them temporary handles. She called them Seventh and Sequence in her private notation, and both names stuck in the way Bridge and Threshold had stuck. What she noticed, over 7 days of watching 200 humans engage with the game at various levels of fluency, was a quality that she had not been able to name before and could now, a specific kind of calm that was not passivity and not resignation, but something more like accurate assessment. Players who had been in the game long enough to understand what it asked of them. The honest bid, the trust of partnership, the willingness to work within uncertainty rather than demanding its elimination, tended to carry themselves differently, not as if they had solved anything, as if they had made peace with the fact that there was nothing to solve. She mentioned this to Volkov, who had been playing for 4 years by then and had become, she thought, one of the most interesting practitioners she'd encountered. Not because he was technically brilliant, but because he had developed a habit of losing well, which was harder than winning well and more instructive. "You're describing equanimity," he said. "I'm describing something earned," she said. "Not the kind that comes from detachment, the kind that comes from engagement. From having played long enough that the uncertainty is familiar." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "The choir has been playing for 200,000 years," he said. "Yes, and they still find us surprising, apparently." He looked out at the integration platform, at the 200 humans and 12 choir members arranged around their respective tables. "That is either very encouraging," he said, "or very frightening." "Both things," Vera said. He smiled, the specific smile of a man who had spent his life with games and had learned to find ambiguity comfortable. "Both things," he agreed. The last time Vera played with Bridge before she left the station, she arrived early. Earlier than she usually arrived, early enough that the observation deck was empty, and the coffee was still brewing, and the stars outside the forward glass held the particular quality she had always found most honest about them. They were not looking back. She sat in the observer's bench with her feet tucked under her, which she had been doing since the first night. The night she'd heard the signal and understood that something vast was looking for them. The coffee made its sounds. The station made its sounds. Outside, the choir's formation was visible as a shimmer at the edge of the sensor range, patient and luminous and very old. Bridge arrived at his usual time, which was also earlier than necessary, which meant he had been arriving early for the same reason she had. She had known this for a year and had not mentioned it. Some things were better as practice than as acknowledgement. He sat across from her. He looked at her with that quality of directed attention, the full weight of whatever consciousness he had. Focused, present, unhurried. She looked back. They did not say anything for a while, in any symbol or gesture or produced grammar. They sat in the specific quality of two beings who had played honestly together for years, and had nothing left to prove, and were simply present, in the moment before the game, in the game that is the moment before. Then she picked up the deck. She shuffled it the way her grandmother had taught her. The long, thorough bridge shuffle that was more ritual than mechanics, the hands moving through motions older than thought. The cards snapped and whispered. The sound was the same as it had always been, the same as it had been in Lagos on Thursday evenings, the same as it would be, she thought, wherever the game went next, on whatever table it sat on, in whatever room it found itself, in the long, patient, continuing unfolding of what they had been beginning. Bridge watched her hands. She held the deck out. He cut it. She dealt. The cards fell into their places. The unknown arranged itself on the table in front of her, face down, waiting. She picked up her hand and fanned it and looked at what she had. 13 cards, some good, some less so. The whole hand a mystery until she understood it, and a different mystery after, the way all hands are. She felt, very precisely, the weight of what was on her side of the table, and what was on Bridge's side and what was still unknown. And she understood, as she always did at this moment, that this was not a problem to be solved, but a situation to be inhabited. You could not know everything. You could only know what you had and trust what you'd built, and bid honestly into the gap. One heart, she said. Bridge was still for 3 seconds. Then he responded. They played. Outside, the stars held their positions with patience that bordered on geological, and the choir's formation shimmered at the edge of sight, and somewhere on Earth, in Lagos or Moscow or Seoul, or any of the 100 places where the game had been sent now, where it was being learned by people who were learning without knowing quite what they were learning. Somewhere a hand was dealt. Cards fell into someone's hands. A bid was made. The game continued as it does. Year 7. The children. This had not been planned by anyone. It happened the way most important things happen, at an angle to expectation, through a gap in the planning that turned out not to be a gap but a door. The first children arrived at Meridian Station as part of a family accompaniment program that Earth's various space agencies had reluctantly instituted when it became clear that 3-year postings were producing psychological strain in researchers whose families remained behind, and that the strain was affecting the quality of the work. So the children came, with their parents, in batches of 20 or 30, rotating through 6-month stays. Vera had not thought much about what would happen when children encountered Bridge and Threshold and the others. She had thought about protocol. There were protocols, and she had thought about safety, which was itself a measure of how thoroughly the threat response had been revised. 18 months ago, that question would have had a very different quality. She had not thought about what it would mean to Bridge. She found out on the 3rd day of the first children's rotation. A girl, 8 years old, named Amara, had wandered into the xenobiology lab while her mother was in a scheduled briefing, and Vera was reviewing reports and Bridge was doing whatever Bridge did when he was not in a session, a state that looked like stillness and that Vera had come to understand as continuous attentiveness, the never quite off of a being whose consciousness did not require the same maintenance that biological sleep provides. Amara walked up to Bridge, stood approximately 2 feet in front of him, and looked at him with the comprehensive evaluative stare of a child who has not yet learned to dress. Observation in politeness. "Are you a robot?" she said. Bridge produced a symbol. "He doesn't know what that means," Vera said carefully. From across the room, Amara looked at Vera. "Does he understand me? Some of what you say, the tone more than the words." Amara looked back at Bridge. She thought for a moment. Then she held out her hand, palm up. The gesture children use when they want to show something, or when they want to receive something, or when they simply want contact. Bridge looked at her hand for 2 seconds. Then he placed his own hand over hers, palm down, very gently, his 2 long fingers curved around her small palm without pressure. Amara looked at their hands. Then she looked up at his face, at the region that was not eyes but functioned as such. "You're warm," she said with evident surprise. Bridge did not produce a symbol. He held very still. "I thought you'd be cold," Amara said. She seemed to consider this new information with the pragmatic reorientation of someone for whom the world is still mostly new information. "That's okay," she said. "I'm warm too." Vera watched Bridge go very still in the way she had learned to read as deep recalculation. The 6-second pause, the processing of something unexpected. Except this time it went longer. 9 seconds, 12. She had never seen him hold that still for that long. When he moved again, he produced a symbol she had not seen before. She studied it. She could not parse it alone. She brought it to Su-Jin that evening, described it, worked through the components. Su-Jin spent a long time on it. When she had a translation, she came back to Vera with the careful expression she wore when she was not certain her translation was complete. "The best I can do," she said, "is something like, 'I did not know this was possible.'" Vera looked at her. "Not I did not expect this," Su-Jin clarified. "Not I was surprised. The symbol is," she paused, "it's more fundamental than surprise. It's the recognition of a category that didn't previously exist. I did not know this class of thing was possible. And now it is." Vera sat with that for a long time. A child had held her hand out, and something 200,000 years old had learned something new. The children took to the game immediately, which was either proof of its design or proof of something about children, or both. Within a week of the first rotation arriving, an informal game had established itself in the recreation module every evening. Children, a couple of researchers, and whichever of the choir representatives wanted to participate. The choir representatives always wanted to participate. What the children brought to the game was something Vera watched with a quality of attention she couldn't quite put down. They played without the weight of strategic consideration. They bid from instinct, with the transparent honesty of beings who had not yet learned to manage information as a resource. They made mistakes extravagantly and without shame. They also occasionally made moves that no experienced player would have made, and that turned out to be exactly right. Moves that came from a place below training, below strategy, from something that might be called pure game sense if you were being generous or pure luck if you weren't. Bridge played with them, carefully, adjusted, but genuinely, not performing, not explaining, playing. And Vera watched him playing with an 8-year-old who did not know the rules yet, and who held her cards fanned backward so everyone could see them. And she thought, this is what 200,000 years of patience earns. The ability to sit at a table with something very new and very uncertain and find it interesting instead of alarming. She thought about the "I did not know this was possible" symbol. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught bridge to Vera at an age when Vera could barely hold the cards, who had sat across the table from a child who understood nothing and played anyway, year after year, until the understanding came. Patience, she thought, was not a virtue. It was a practice. You practiced it the way you practiced anything, by doing it, hand after hand, year after year, until it became what you were. Year 9, the return. Vera went home for the first time since initial posting. 8 days on Earth, enough to remember what gravity felt like in your bones, what rain smelled like, what it was like to stand in a supermarket and be surrounded by the specific human noise of people wanting things and getting them, and wanting other things. She went to Lagos. She went to her grandmother's house, which had been her aunt's house now for almost a decade, which still had the kitchen table, and still had the wobbling leg, and still had the card shelf with a new deck that her aunt had bought but had kept. In the same place on the same shelf, as if changing the position would break something. She sat at the table. She put her hands flat on it. She looked at the empty chairs. Her aunt sat down across from her without being asked, because her aunt was the kind of woman who understood what sitting down means. "How is it up there?" her aunt asked. Vera thought about how to answer this. She thought about 11 years of honest bids and accumulated resonance, and the shape that love leaves, and children with their cards held backward, and a being 200,000 years old learning a new category. "Better than I expected," she said. "Different. Different how?" "I thought contact would be about what they are," she said, "and it turned out to be more about what we are, what we can be." Her aunt looked at her with the specific attention of a woman who has been paying attention to her family for 70 years and has learned that the indirect statement often contains the direct truth. "Are you coming back?" she asked. "To the station?" Vera said. "Yes. 1 more year, I think, and then," she paused. The game will keep going without me. That's how it's supposed to work. Her aunt nodded. She reached across and patted Vera's hand once, in the way she had, practical and definite. Then she got up and went to the shelf and came back with the deck. "Teach me," she said. Vera looked at her. "You already know how to play." "I know the old rules," her aunt said. "Teach me the new ones." Vera picked up the deck. She shuffled it. The long, thorough shuffle. The ritual one. The cards snapped and whispered in the warm kitchen air. Outside, Lagos did what Lagos does in the evening. It was loud and warm, and alive with the specific, irreducible human energy of a city that has been there for a very long time and plans to keep going. She held the deck out. Her aunt cut it. She dealt. Year 11, the last hand. She was ready to go. She had known it for about 6 months. The particular readiness of someone who has done a thing fully and can feel the completion of it, not as failure or exhaustion, but as the specific satisfaction of work that found its ending at the right time. Bridge had known too, in the way Bridge knew things, not because she had told him, but because 11 years of honest play left no more secrets. Her hands said everything. He had read her as thoroughly as she had read him, which was itself a kind of completion. She did not make a ceremony of it. She played the game, the last game, the same way she had played the first one, with her gut, with her grandmother's method, with the specific quality of attention that comes from knowing that every hand is the hand. When the last card fell, she sat for a moment and looked at the table. The game was what it had always been. Incomplete information resolved into communication, uncertainty honored and inhabited rather than eliminated. A structure built for the meeting of minds that do not have the same language, the same lifespan, the same relationship with time. A table at which two very different things could sit down and learn each other. She had been learning bridge for 11 years. She would carry what she had learned for whatever was left. And Bridge, who had been changed by the game, who had accumulated her in his resonance structure the way a bell holds a note, Bridge would carry her too. She collected the cards, she shuffled them, she held them out. Bridge cut the deck. He paused for a moment with his hands on it, the two long fingers resting against the worn edges of the deck. And she understood that he was saying something he did not have a symbol for. She put her hand on his, just for a moment. Then she took the deck back and placed it on the table between them. "For the next one," she said. He produced the "now we have been beginning" symbol. "Yes," she said, "it's always still beginning." She stood up. She looked at him for a long moment, at the quality of his attention, the patient fullness of his presence. This being from a civilization so old it had watched human civilization begin and had decided, at the right moment, that it was worth sitting down across from. "Thank you," she said. He placed his hand on his chest and moved it toward her. She placed her hand on her chest and moved it toward him. They held the gesture for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked toward the door, and the door opened, and the corridor beyond it was the same corridor it had always been, except that everything on the other side of it was different now, and she was different, and the universe, patient, enormous, not empty after all, waited as it always had with all the time in the world. Behind her she heard a small sound, cards being shuffled. She did not turn back, she kept walking.